At 63, I thought I knew what it meant to be tired. But the morning I poured half-brewed coffee into my travel mug and tiptoed through the house I once owned, I realized I'd only known the shallow end of exhaustion. My son Randall and his wife Oilia slept peacefully upstairs while I headed out to my first job of the day. I paid them $5,000 a month to rent the home I'd given them after my husband died. Every dollar came from 3 jobs that left my body aching and my spirit hollow. The cruelest part was pretending this was temporary when deep down I knew it wasn't. By 4:30 a.m., the alarm dragged me out of bed. The narrow mattress in Randall's childhood room creaked under my stiff joints. I moved quietly so Oilia wouldn't complain about the noise again. The coffee machine hissed. Its sound alone could start a fight. When her shrill voice cut through the air, "Della the coffee maker is too loud," I shut it off mid-brew and swallowed the bitterness instead of the coffee. At 5:30 a.m., I drove my 12-year-old Honda to the grocery store. The car, she said, made the neighborhood look poor. The hours blurred. I bagged groceries until my hands trembled, scrubbed other people's floors until my knees screamed, and ended each night wiping down tables at the diner while my son and his wife enjoyed takeout from the most expensive Italian place in town. I told myself love required sacrifice, that maybe one day they'd appreciate what I gave. But that illusion shattered the night I broke a plate. It was 4 p.m. when I came home, too tired to think. My legs felt like stone, and I was halfway through making a peanut butter sandwich when the dish slipped from my hands and shattered across the kitchen tile. The sound was sharp and final. Randall stormed downstairs, irritation replacing concern. "Jesus, Mom, be more careful," he muttered. Before I could answer, Oilia appeared in her silk robe, the scent of expensive perfume following her like a shadow. Her lips curled into disgust. "We can't even have one peaceful afternoon without you breaking something." I crouched to collect the shards. A piece sliced my palm and a drop of blood hit the tile. "I'll replace it," I said quietly. Oilia laughed cold and bright. "Replace it with what money you can barely keep up with rent." I looked at my son, hoping for kindness, but he crossed his arms. "She's right, Mom. You need to be more careful. We can't afford this. We." As if they'd earned a cent of what I worked for. Something inside me cracked, then not the plate, not my pride, but the illusion that love meant obedience. I rose slowly, my bleeding hand trembling but steady. "You're right," I said, voice calm. "I'm tired of making messes." I turned, walked to my small room, and began packing. That night after my diner shift, the house was silent. I left the envelope with next week's rent on the table, the last payment they would ever see from me. Then at 2 a.m., I sat in a cheap motel, smelling of disinfectant, holding a napkin with a phone number scrawled on it. Margaret from work had mentioned a friend with an apartment for rent cash, only no questions. On the 4th ring, a gruff voice answered. "You running from something?" he asked. Not something I whispered, someone. By 8 a.m., I stood outside 412 Maple Street. The landlord, Frank Gutierrez, handed me the keys after a short talk and a handshake. The apartment was tiny, 1-bedroom, outdated appliances, but the morning light streamed through the windows like freedom. I spent my savings on an air mattress, some dishes, and groceries that were mine alone. For the first time in months, I bought ice cream simply because I wanted it. When Randall's calls started flooding in, I let them ring. 43 missed calls in 2 days. His voicemails sounded desperate, his wife's voice sugary and false. I knew they weren't worried about me. They were worried about losing their source of income. Frank knocked on my door that evening, his weathered face kind. "Some guy's been driving around asking questions about you," he said. "Told him I don't know nobody's mother." I thanked him, and he nodded. Sometimes family ain't who you're born with. Sometimes it's who lets you live your own life. Weeks passed. I quit 2 of my jobs and kept the house cleaning work that didn't break my back. My body healed, my mind quieted, and my phone finally stopped buzzing. Then one day, Mrs. Chen, one of my clients, mentioned a for sale sign going up on a house nearby. When she said the address, my breath caught. It was Randall's house, my old home. That evening I drove by. The lawn was overgrown, the flower beds, dead newspapers scattered on the porch. The house looked just as I had felt abandoned. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt nothing. But the next day, curiosity led me to pick up when my old neighbor Betty called. "Della, your son's been telling everyone you're unstable," she said gently. "He says you disappeared and might hurt yourself." My grip tightened on the phone. Did he mention he charged me $5,000 a month to live in my own house? Silence? Then a quiet gasp. No, he didn't. Of course he didn't, I said. That story wouldn't make him the concerned son, would it? After hanging up, I laughed for the first time in months, not from joy, but from disbelief at his desperation to preserve his image. A few days later, Mrs. Rodriguez told me her daughter worked at the bank where Randall had begged for a loan extension. "They're in deep trouble," she said. "The mortgage payment alone is over $4,000. I realized then how fragile their comfort had been built entirely on my labor. Still, I wasn't prepared for what came next. At the grocery store one afternoon, I ran into Oilia. Her perfect facade had cracked, wrinkled clothes, tired eyes, trembling hands. "We've been so worried," she said with a forced smile. "Where have you been?" I placed my groceries on the counter without looking at her. "Somewhere I don't have to pay $5,000 a month to be insulted." Her expression hardened. "Randall's sick with worry. Before or after you put the house up for sale?" Her face drained of color. "Who told you about that word gets around?" I said, "especially when you're asking twice what it's worth." Her voice dropped to a hiss. "You can't abandon your family over one little argument. You're his mother, you have responsibilities." I met her glare evenly. "You're right. I do have responsibilities to myself." Then I walked away, leaving her standing speechless amid the sound of scanning groceries and murmuring strangers. In that moment, I felt something stronger than anger, freedom. 2 days later, while I lingered over a rare latte at the corner cafe, a woman with kind eyes paused by my table and asked if I was Mrs. Morrison. She introduced herself as Sarah. She dated Randall in college, and before I could weigh caution against curiosity, I nodded toward the empty chair. Her voice was soft but steady as she described the Randall she had known, charming at first, then coaxing, then demanding, then blaming. He'd pushed her to take out student loans in her name for his expenses. When she hesitated, he accused her of not believing in his potential. He'd isolated her with manufactured conflicts and then presented himself as the only calm in the storm he'd created. The final break came, she said, when he tried to get her to ask her parents for money to invest, which turned out to be a cover for gambling losses. She wasn't bitter, she was relieved, and she was clear-eyed about the pattern I had finally started to see. "It wasn't your fault," she said, touching my hand before she left. "He learned which hearts would always open." I sat with that sentence long after she'd gone, hearing in it the bone-deep truth I had refused to accept. A mother's love can be a doorway or a shield, and I had let him walk through mine carrying all his worst habits. That evening I drove past the old house for reasons I couldn't name. The lawn had surrendered to weeds. Flyers clung to the front door like damp regrets. A black luxury SUV idled in the driveway, unfamiliar and glossy. I waited a few car lengths down engine, off a strange calm sitting beside my pulse. 20 minutes later, the front door opened and Oilia stepped out with a man whose smile gleamed as if it had been polished for the occasion. They kissed without hesitation. When he pulled away, I caught the flash of a watch that probably cost more than my old Honda. She waved once like a queen dismissing a servant, and he drove off into the slow blue of evening. Pity was not the emotion I expected to feel, but there it was, surprising and cool. Randall had been my jailer these past months, but he was also a man trapped by his own illusions. The house he tightened around me was collapsing over his head. I called my sister Margaret in Phoenix at 7 p.m., unsure how to begin after 2 years of silence. The truth tumbled out in pieces, and she listened without rushing me. When I asked whether she'd ever seen anything troubling in Randall as a teenager, she hesitated only long enough to be kind. Yes, she said carefully. He'd known how to twist guilt into a leash. He'd always talked about money like it was something other people owed him for existing. I thought you saw it too, she admitted, but I didn't want to be the aunt who criticized your only child. We hung up promising to speak again soon, but I stayed by the window staring at the long rectangle of evening sky and realizing how many small warnings I had filed under love. A week later, while I vacuumed Mrs. Patterson's living room, she mentioned her grandson's job at the casino across town. He'd told her about a couple who came in regularly, the man restless and sweaty, losing big at poker, the woman cool and distant collecting winnings when they landed, gone when they didn't. The grandson thought it looked like a setup, a way to move someone else's money in clean lines under bright lights. My hands went still on the vacuum handle. I could see the web now, a gambler husband bleeding out cash, a wife whose loyalty was a mask, a wealthy suitor called Marcus, feeding the pretense with carefully stacked bills. I shut off the vacuum, told Mrs. Patterson I was feeling faint, and sat on her stoop until the world stopped leaning. If the truth was a tide, it came in fully 3 days later. Betty from the old neighborhood called at 10 a.m., whispered that Randall had just left the house alone, frantic and gray. She'd overheard him begging the bank for an extension voice cracking in the driveway. My car turned toward that house as if it still knew the way. When I knocked, Oilia opened the door, her relief so theatrical I almost laughed. She ushered me inside with cooing apologies and empty concern. The air smelled like lemon polish and fear. I didn't sit. "How is Marcus?" I asked, and the color fell out of her face. She recovered fast, but not fast enough. I laid it out with the steadiness of someone who has nothing left to lose: the SUV, the kiss, the casino, the money that moved when Randall won and never stayed when he lost. She slumped into an armchair and stared at the rug like it held a map out of this conversation. "You don't understand," she said finally. "Your son owes people who don't do payment plans. We're drowning and Marcus was a rope." I shook my head. "No, he was a hook. And I've been the bait." I told her what would come next. Not my money, not my labor, not my silence. If Randall wanted my help, he would have to get real help, 12 weeks of treatment, not 12 apologies. He would have to choose between saving his marriage and saving himself. He would have to understand there would be no second rescue if he chose wrong. When I reached the door, she stood and followed, anger returning like a coward who thinks the door is locked. "You can't abandon your family," she hissed. "I already did," I said quietly, "and I abandoned no one, only the roles that kept us all dishonest." I left her there in the entryway, clutching the frame like a cliff. The next morning at 6:30 a.m., someone knocked on my apartment door with a sound so tentative I almost didn't hear it. Randall stood in the hallway, unshaven and hollow-eyed hands, shaking as if they hadn't learned how to be still in weeks. He stepped inside when I moved aside and sat stiffly on my thrift store couch, his gaze flicking over the small evidences of a life that wasn't about him. The single coffee cup on the table, the library book splayed face down, the cheap potted mint on the windowsill. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words for once didn't slide around the room looking for a place to hide. I told him I didn't hate him and that I didn't trust him. Both were true, and the truth settled between us like an honest chair. He spoke of fear of gambling that felt at first like a lever to lift a family out of grief and debt, then like a trap he called destiny. He named the number he had lost, $87,000 over 3 years, not to shock me, but because facts were the only bridge left. He admitted that Oilia had encouraged bigger bets while Marcus bankrolled the fantasy of salvation. He said he'd found a residential program that began the following week. He said he would lose the house while he was gone, but he would lose his life if he stayed. I listened for the heat of manipulation, the pleading twist, the sly angle. Instead, I heard a tired man choosing to be small for a while in order to live. "I won't be your net," I said. "Not again." He nodded, eyes raw. "If you relapse or lie, I walk away." He closed his eyes like someone bracing for a necessary blow. "I understand." When he left just after 7 a.m., I sat in the quiet and let the relief arrive in stages, first like air, then like water, then like sleep. Outside, the day warmed itself along the eaves. I watered the mint and felt my hands steady. 6 months passed before I saw Randall again. The world had softened around the edges, as if even the air was learning to forgive. I'd planted tomatoes in the small strip of soil behind the apartment building, and Frank had taught me how to tell when they were ripe. When I heard footsteps on the gravel path, I looked up expecting a neighbor, but it was my son, clean-shaven, standing straighter, his eyes clear. The gauntness had lifted from his face, replaced by something quieter, steadier. He smiled, hesitant, but real. "Hi, Mom." I wiped my hands on my gardening gloves and nodded toward the bench. "You look good." He sat beside me, careful not to intrude on my space. "I feel good," he said, for the first time in years. He told me about the residential program, 12 weeks that had felt like years, endless meetings and confessions, days without phones, nights of confronting the wreckage of his choices. His counselor, he said, had been a man who'd once lost everything to gambling, including his family. He told me it's never about the money, Randall said. It's about control, about thinking luck is proof of worth. I listened without interrupting, watching sunlight catch in the garden's wire fence. He worked now at a hardware store, earning less in a month than he once spent in a week, but proud of every dollar. The manager, another recovered addict, had given him a chance. "It's honest work," he said. "I'm learning what that feels like." There was a lightness in his tone I hadn't heard in years, a quiet humility that made me ache and hope at once. "I'm at step 8 now," he added, making a list of the people I've harmed and becoming willing to make amends. He turned to face me fully. "You're at the top of that list." I felt the familiar pull of old wounds, the instinct to wave away his guilt with a mother's comfort. But that version of me had retired. I nodded instead. Making amends isn't just saying sorry, it's changing what happens next. He smiled faintly. "That's what my counselor said. He also said some relationships can't go back to what they were, and that's okay." I met his eyes. He's right. We sat in companionable silence, watching a robin hop along the fence line. "Are you happy?" he asked after a while. The question startled me. Happiness had once seemed like a luxury for other people, something I'd glimpsed through windows but never owned. "Yes," I said, finally surprised by how easy it was to tell the truth. "I am." Randall nodded as if he'd been waiting to hear that since he was a child. My phone buzzed and I glanced down. It was Frank sending a picture of his newborn granddaughter. "Your landlord's become family, huh?" Randall said, smiling. "Something like that. We help each other." I showed him the photo of the wrinkled baby in a pink blanket, and for the first time he laughed, not the brittle, nervous laugh I remembered, but something genuine. "You have a life that fits you now," he said softly. "I'm glad." I told him about Sarah Williams, his college ex, now teaching 3rd grade after finishing her degree. "She invited me to dinner this weekend to celebrate her new job," I said. "Frank's coming too." Randall's eyebrows lifted. "You two stayed in touch." "She helped me understand that I wasn't crazy for believing in you," I said, "and that I wasn't weak for walking away." He nodded slowly, absorbing it. I'm glad she was there when I couldn't be. When he stood to leave, I noticed the careful rhythm he'd learned, the respect for boundaries, the understanding that love could exist without dependency. "Before I go," he said, "I wanted to tell you something. I drove by the old house last week." I tensed, but he continued. "It's gone to auction." I thought I'd be devastated, but I wasn't. I realized the house was never home. It was just a monument to everything I refused to change. He smiled faintly. Losing it was the best thing that ever happened to me. He hesitated, then added Oilia's still with Marcus. They moved to the suburbs, I heard. I hope she's happy. I really do. We were bad for each other. For once I believed him. After he left, I stayed in the garden as twilight thickened, surrounded by the hum of distant lives. My phone chimed again, a message from my sister Margaret, another from Mrs. Chen, adjusting her cleaning schedule, and one from Frank, asking if I wanted to watch a movie later. I smiled. A year ago, every sound from my phone had meant panic overdue bills, guilt-laden messages, demands disguised as affection. Now each one carried warmth, an invitation, instead of an obligation. I thought about Randall's question, "Am I happy?" The truth was layered. Happiness wasn't fireworks or miracles. It was this waking up without dread, choosing when to speak and when to rest. Knowing my worth didn't come from what I gave, but from who I was. I was Della Morrison, 64, owner of a secondhand couch, a garden that fed me, and a peace I'd earned one sleepless night at a time. When the phone rang again, I answered. "Hey, Della," Frank said, his voice warm with its usual mix of humor and care. "Popcorn's ready. You still up for that movie?" I looked at the tomatoes glowing faintly in the dusk, the life that had grown from the ruins of another, and felt a rush of quiet gratitude. "I'll be right down," I said. As I gathered my tools and walked inside, I thought about the woman who had fled in the middle of the night months ago, the one who'd left a house of insults and debt without a note. She hadn't known where she was going, only that she couldn't stay. That woman had saved me, and now at last I was living for both of us. If this story touched, you take a moment to like, share, and subscribe for more stories, like Della's stories about strength, self-respect, and the quiet power of walking away. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in her place?